We'll be talking about modifiers today, and this time it's dangling modifiers. We've already discussed what adjectives and adverbs are and how some modifiers are misplaced. Now we'll be discussing the dangling modifiers. Dangling modifiers are mistakes that we make with modifiers too. And this time the modifiers are always phrases. If you'll recall, misplaced modifiers had either phrases or individual words. The dangling modifier is always at the beginning of the sentence. These are descriptive phrases that are not describing the word that they're next to. Here are some examples of dangling modifiers. Riding his bike, a German Shepherd bit Tony on the ankle. Riding his bike is a dangling modifier. It's a dangling modifier because it's not describing a German Shepherd. While Tony was riding his bike, a German Shepherd bit him. Now we know that Tony was riding his bike. Or we could say a German Shepherd bit Tony, who was riding his bike, on the ankle. It's a little more awkward. Here's another one. Angry and sullen, Mother scolded Mary for sulking in her room. Now maybe Mother was angry and sullen, but the fact that she scolded tells me that Peggy was probably the angry and sullen person who was sulking. So we need to repair this dangling modifier by changing it, by changing the dangling modifier into a dependent word phrase. Mother scolded Peggy, who was angry and sullen, for sulking in her room. Or, because Peggy was angry and sullen, Mother scolded Peggy for sulking in her room. Both of those highlighted phrases are dependent word phrases. Now, when you're looking for dangling modifiers, the easy clue is you'll always find them at the beginning of the sentence. Oftentimes, they're participle phrases, and sometimes those dangling modifiers are additional description. And when I use the term additional description, it's from our Verner rule. It was the third one on the exceptions to the comma usage. So, dangling modifiers are always at the beginning of a sentence. Here's the example. Running and crying, the policeman chased the burglar down the sidewalk. Perhaps the policeman was running and crying, but we suspect the burglar was. Now, the dangling modifiers oftentimes are participle phrases. Recall that participle phrases have a word that looks like a verb, it has an ing ending or an ed ending. Run over by the car, Jack picked up his mangled bicycle. I hope that the bicycle was run over by the car rather than Jack. Here's another one. Running and crying, the policeman chased the burglar down the sidewalk. In this case, running and crying, we have the ing participles. Run over by the car, the run was the ed ending. Now, dangling modifiers are sometimes additional description. Here's an example. Shiny and red, Mary ate the apple. Maybe she was shiny and red, but we're suspecting the apple was. Now, dangling modifiers are at the beginning of a sentence, and they do not describe the noun that the phrase is next to. Dangling modifiers are at the beginning of the sentence. I want you to notice the ings, and to fix them, change the phrase into a dependent word phrase by adding a dependent word and by adding a doer of the phrase and by adding a verb. Do not use the verbal for a verb. So here we have shiny and red, Mary ate the apple. And right now it's a dangling modifier because shiny and red is not describing Mary. So we can change shiny and red into a dependent word phrase. We add the word because, which is the dependent word. We have the apple as the subject, and there is a verb, was. Because the apple was shiny and red, Mary ate it. Here's another dangling modifier. Running and crying, the policeman chased the burglar down the sidewalk. And we will assume the policeman is not running and crying. Let's fix it. While the burglar was running and crying, the policeman chased him down the sidewalk. In this case, we have while as the dependent word, the burglar is the subject, was running is the verb. Now sometimes we will move the dangling modifier. Remember, with misplaced modifiers, we always move the modifier. But in this case, sometimes we will move the dangling modifier. But when we move it, the best way to fix the sentence is to change that moved phrase into a dependent word phrase. Here's an example. Shiny and red, Mary ate the apple. Okay, what we've done is we've moved the phrase closer to apple. Mary ate the apple, which was shiny and red. Now, which is the dependent word, which is referring to the subject apple right next to it, and we have was as the verb. So we have all three elements still for the dependent word phrase. Dangling modifiers are easy to find because they're always at the beginning of the sentence and they do not describe the noun that follows them. They're actually easier to find than misplaced modifiers. Fixing the dangling modifier takes a little more work though. With misplaced modifiers, you simply moved the phrase. With dangling modifiers, you're probably going to change the dangling modifier into a dependent word phrase. So you turn the phrase into that dependent word phrase, and you have to have the three elements: a dependent word, and a subject, and a verb. Or sometimes you're going to move that phrase next to the noun that it describes, away from the beginning of the sentence. Nevertheless, you should still use a who or a which or a that, those dependent words.